All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 7 out of 8. So we are almost at the conclusion of the course. We've got tonight's session where we're going to discuss leadership, and we'll handle tonight's session as we usually do, where we'll present some information on leadership and different leadership styles and different leadership theories. And then we'll do our breakout groups where we apply the information to our given organizations. So basic type of same approach that we always take just for the topic of leadership tonight. And I know that you've probably run into leadership here and there throughout your time in the MPA program so far. I also looked at your schedule and I see that you are scheduled to move into your next class, which is organizational leadership. So I think what tonight will probably end up being is a good foreshadowing for some of the theories that you'll talk about more in depth once you get to your next class in organizational leadership. So that's tonight. And then next week will be our last Zoom session. And I will be out of town next week. I'm presenting at a conference, but I'm still planning on having class. I just think we'll probably do an abbreviated session next week. Originally, what I had planned is that we would spend next week talking about organizational change and its effect on effectiveness, and then also talk about some of the necessary conditions for effectiveness in organizations. I decided to kind of truncate that approach and not talk about organizational change, but just really focus more on a discussion of some of the necessary conditions for effectiveness in our organizations, and then kind of use the session to tie up the loose ends and talk about some of the morals of the story, if you will, of effectiveness in organizations. So next week, I think we'll probably have an abbreviated session, maybe an hour or so. But if all goes well, still planning on having that live session next week. Thank you for the submission of your models of motivation Canvas essay. I've gone through and read and reviewed all of those and provided a grade and brief feedback on each one of those as well. So that's now behind you. Now you're moving on to your next Canvas essay. And your next Canvas essay will take some of the information we talked about here tonight on leadership and then apply that information to your organization. So for that Canvas essay, you're going to be talking about the type of leadership styles that you tend to see in your organization. You'll also talk about how those leadership styles contribute to or detract from the effectiveness of the organization, and then offer up to me some new models or different models of leadership or different leadership styles that you think could be more effective than the leadership styles that you currently see in your organization. Excuse me. So that's Canvas essay, I guess, where we're up to number 7 now. And that one then is due for next week. And then, as I said, next week we'll do an abbreviated session on the necessary conditions for effectiveness in public organizations. Okay, any questions or anything at all before we get started with our discussion of leadership for the evening?
I have a question not related to our discussion tonight, but to the final essay.
Sure, go ahead.
So I know we are supposed to choose like our solution in the final paper. Are we allowed to like do a combination of 2 of the solutions we had previously outlined and say we kind of like recreated this quasi or just like a blend of the 2 solutions?
Absolutely. And that's actually, I've been doing this course for many years and using that assignment for many years. That's kind of the common approach, is where instead of just picking one of the solutions, people will present a hybrid of maybe 2 of the solutions or maybe even all 3 of the solutions as their chosen solution. So yes, that's very common.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's talk a bit about leadership. And again, I know that you've run into leadership and discussion of leadership before in the MPA program, and that you're going to have lengthy discussions of leadership in your next class. So I don't think we have to spend a lot of time and really belabor the topic, but it is important to talk about leadership in its relationship to effectiveness, because clearly it's going to be difficult for our public organizations to be effective unless they have effective leadership. I think we all have a general sense and understanding of what leadership is. You've probably introduced to definitions of leadership before in the program. Leadership usually encompasses oftentimes all of the following: the ability to induce compliance. That's kind of like a Chester Barnard approach to leadership. The ability to exercise influence. And when you talk about the use of power and using power as a resource, using power usually involves exercising influence over others, to try and influence others to do something that perhaps they wouldn't normally do or naturally do. Ability to persuade. We know that one of the main differences between leadership in the public sector and leadership in the private sector is that public managers don't have the same amount of control that private sector managers do. We don't have, as we talked about last week, we don't have the same extrinsic rewards and incentives that our private sector counterparts have. We're subject to a lot more rules and regulations and oversight from executive and legislative and judicial actors. So because we have these types of limitations, these parameters that we have to operate within, we can't tell people as easily as you can in the private sector. Instead, you have to persuade people. And there's a whole body of literature in political science that looks at presidential studies. And, when you think about leadership, the ultimate example of leadership would be a US president. And, as Richard Neustadt tells us, the primary power of a president is that president's power to persuade. Another example of that is Harry Truman. When Harry Truman was leaving the White House and Dwight David Eisenhower was coming in as the new president, Truman said that Eisenhower would be the most frustrated person in Washington, D.C., because Eisenhower was very comfortable telling people what to do in the military, and people would do exactly what he told them. He would tell them to jump, and they would say, "How high, sir?" You do that when you're told to jump by a general in the military. Truman knew that when Eisenhower came in as president, he wouldn't be able to tell people to do things and just expect them to do it because of his position as president. He would have to persuade. And one of the great persuaders, if you will, in terms of presidents, someone like Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson had a lot of problems in his presidency, the Vietnam War and the battles over civil rights legislation. But he was a master persuader. And one of my favorite series of pictures is a series of pictures of Lyndon Johnson lobbying a member from, I believe it was Vermont. I think it was a senator from Vermont. And Johnson was a pretty imposing figure. He was, I think, 6'3", 6'4", big Texan. And this poor senator from Vermont was about 5'7", 5'8". And there's a picture, in the first picture, Johnson and the senator are standing as close to face as they could get, but they're standing about a foot between them. And Johnson is lobbying the senator to support the legislation that he wants him to support. Then the next picture, you see the senator is backed up against the desk and Johnson is leaning over him, and his face is probably no more than a couple of inches from the face of the senator. Then the third picture, you see the senator bent all the way over on the desk. I mean, he was leaning all the way back on the desk. Johnson then leaning over really close to his face, again, less than an inch from his face. That's him persuading that senator to try to get him to vote for that piece of legislation. There's a lot of persuasive power that needs to be used in the presidency, and oftentimes public leaders and managers need to have that type of persuasive power as well. The ability to achieve goals, and that just picks up from what we've talked about throughout the entire course, the goal attainment model of measuring effectiveness. Leaders need to be able to get their organizations and their employees to achieve goals. Amber mentions in text chat charisma, and charisma is obviously very important for leaders. And I think you could argue that presidents, in order to ascend to the presidency, they need to have charisma. And there's a lot of charismatic leadership that they need to display. And we'll talk later on tonight about charismatic leadership and how charismatic leadership differs from another type of leadership, such as transactional leadership. By leadership, I think when most people think about the term leadership, they mean the capacity of someone to direct and energize people to achieve goals. That's kind of a good working definition of what we mean tonight by leadership. We also know, if we read through the literature, and there's a huge body of literature on leadership in the public sector. It's one of those hot topics that really never goes away. If you read through some of the literature on public leadership, you'll see that some of the scholars will make a distinction between leadership and management. Now, in this class tonight, we're going to kind of work with them interchangeably just for our limited purposes tonight. But a lot of scholars will make the argument that leadership is not management. There is a distinct difference between the two. And for a lot of scholars, the big difference between leadership and management is that management almost always involves the allocation of resources. Managers manage resources. They decide where those resources should go. They decide who gets to spend those resources. They allocate resources. Leaders may allocate resources, and it's possible that's part of what they do as a leader, but they don't necessarily always allocate resources. A lot of leaders will leave the actual allocation of resources to their managers. And the leader sees their role as being more of a visionary, establishing a vision and a direction for the organization. But throughout the years, the leadership literature has developed a lot of different theories and approaches to understanding what is considered to be effective leadership and what can be considered to be ineffective leadership. Now, if you back up the story back several decades ago, one of the first approaches to studying leadership was to study leadership from a trait-based type of an approach. And these trait-based models of leadership assume that there were certain characteristics, personality characteristics, that made for good leaders. So good leaders had a high level of intelligence. They had a high amount of foresight. They could foresee problems and be proactive. They had personality characteristics such as enthusiasm, persistence, not leaving a problem until that problem was resolved. Where the trait-based approach to leadership kind of took us was down the road to assuming that some people are born to be better leaders than others, and that there are some characteristics that people are born with that will lead, no pun intended, lead them to be better leaders, and some other people just don't possess those characteristics. That assumption is kind of troublesome for us in an MPA program because most MPA programs will have a class on leadership. In some programs, it's a core course. In some programs, it's an elective course. But we assume in an MPA program that we can teach leadership skills. It's not really a set of traits. It's more a set of skills that can be taught. And when you assume it's a set of skills that can be taught, then again, that gives you the foundation for having leadership discussions like the one we're having tonight, leadership courses and MPA programs, and indeed entire graduate programs have emerged on leadership. You can get a doctorate in organizational leadership. You can get master's degrees in organization leadership. You can get master's degrees in campaign leadership. If you are interested in campaigns, you can go to George Washington University and get a master's in campaign leadership. So we assume that it's not just something you're born with, but there are some discernible skills that you can acquire that will enhance your ability in terms of being a leader. One of the oldest approaches to leadership that really still frames many of the questions that we ask and answer today in modern leadership studies goes all the way back to the Ohio State studies. And the Ohio State studies are known, back in the 1950s, were known for this leadership behavior questionnaire. And through this leadership behavior questionnaire, the Ohio State studies identified two different dimensions. And these two dimensions, even though they were developed back in the 1950s, continue to be used throughout the literature today. And those two leadership dimensions are consideration for people versus consideration for essentially production. Some authors will call it consideration for structure, consideration for task. It basically means production. So are you concerned about your employees? Are you concerned about helping your employees develop as human resources? Or are you more concerned about making the organization productive? Obviously, if you're more concerned about making the organization productive, that kind of harkens back to classic organization theory. If you're more concerned about your relationship with your employees, that's going to harken back to human relations and human resource management theory. So that was kind of the this binary type of definition that we got out of the Ohio State studies in the 1950s. And then not long after that, the University of Michigan came along with their approach to leadership studies, which was surprisingly very similar to the Ohio State studies. They refer to it as concern for people versus concern for task. And since I'm from Ohio, as oftentimes happens, Michigan was a little bit behind Ohio State, but they eventually got there. So let's take the Ohio State studies and this kind of typology of leaders concerned for people versus leaders concerned for production. And on the graph you see on the screen, you can see 5 different leadership or management styles. And I said, we're going to kind of use those terms interchangeably for our limited purposes tonight. But different styles of leadership and management based upon where leader scores in terms of concern for people versus concern for production. The bottom left-hand corner is obviously going to be the worst place to be as a leader or manager, and that's impoverished management. This is where you score low on your concern for people, and you also can score very low on your concern for production. So on your y-axis, you have concern for people on an ordinal level from a low of 1 to a high of 9. On your x-axis, you have concern for production, a low of 1, a high of 9. Those impoverished leaders and managers are in the bottom left-hand corner. Effective production is considered to be unattainable. And it's unobtainable because people are lazy, they're apathetic, they're indifferent. Sound and mature relationships are difficult to achieve because of human nature, and conflict is always going to happen. This is kind of your Douglas McGregor Theory X approach to your employees. In that green cell, the top left, you have country club management. Very high on concern for people, very low on concern for production. Production's incidental to the lack of conflict and the creation of good fellowship among employees. Top right-hand corner, the light blue is team management. That's really what we're hoping to get from our leaders and managers. Production, it comes from the integration of tasks and human requirements, scoring high on both concern for people as well as concern for production. The purple on the bottom right, task management. People are a commodity like machines. Again, a classical organization theory type of approach. Manager's responsibility is to plan, direct, and control the work of those subordinate to them. And then right in the middle, you have the dampened pendulum, middle of the road, push for production, but don't go all out, be fair, yet be firm. And those are for managers who are kind of, as my stats professor used to say, fair and middling on both of those two variables, concern for people as well as concern for production. Now, it is a very simplistic way of looking at leadership, but I do emphasize it to begin our discussion tonight because it still undergirds a lot of the modern theories in leadership that we see today. This typology of concern for people versus concern for production. Another approach that we see used that again kind of builds off of this whole task versus people orientation is what's known as Fiedler's contingency theory. Fiedler's contingency theory recognized the importance of situational leadership. And they recognized that we're always not going to be task-oriented. We're also always not going to be people-oriented. How task or people-oriented we are will depend, it depends, on the situation in which we find ourselves. So Fiedler developed this idea of what he called the LPC, the least preferred coworker approach. And the LPC, least preferred coworker approach, what you would do is you would have the leader or manager envision the type of employee who they would least prefer to work with. So the person you don't want to work with, your least preferred coworker. And then take that least preferred coworker and evaluate that least preferred coworker based upon their performance. Some leaders or managers, even though this is a least preferred coworker, will still give them relatively decent evaluations. Those are your high LPC types of leaders. Other leaders would score those least preferred coworkers very low. Those are your low LPC leaders. So high LPC leaders are relationship oriented. Low LPC leaders are more task oriented. But again, it's not the type of one size fits all approach. A low LPC approach, a very task oriented approach, may be helpful in, according to Fiedler, very favorable or very unfavorable settings. And so if things are going really, really well, or things are going very, very poorly, that's when a low LPC approach may be effective. However, when you're in the middle, that kind of indeterminate type of area where everything's not great, everything's not terrible, but it's kind of an indeterminate, intermediate type of situation, that's where the high LPC approach tends to work. And obviously, most of our organizations are probably going to find themselves somewhere in that gray area, that indeterminate type of area, and that tends to be where the high LPC approach works most appropriately. But whether you use a low LPC, a task orientation, or a high LPC, a relationship orientation, is probably going to be contingent upon things such as your leader-member relationships. So what types of relationships have been already established between leaders and employees? Do they already have a good relationship, a trusting relationship? Do they have a poor relationship where there's not a whole lot of trust? See, an example of it, yeah, it was just you literally take a hypothetical situation. So you're going to create this hypothetical employee. So you're going to be told, think about a person who is the worst person that you could work with, that you think is the least productive person you could work with, and then evaluate that type of performance. Tell us how well that person is performing. So basically what it means is for high LPC leaders, people who are performing very poorly are probably still going to get decent types of evaluations. For low LPC leaders, because they are so task-oriented, those people are going to get very low evaluations. So why, as an high LPC leader, would you want to give a higher evaluation to a very poorly performing employee? Well, one thing could be to build trust and to build that rapport, because you are more focused on the relationship with your employees than you are in terms of productivity. A low LPC type of leader doesn't really care about that relationship. They're much more concerned about getting the job done, so they don't really see much of a need to give these higher types of evaluations. They're going to give a very tough evaluation to make sure the tasks get done and the organization gets its job done when it needs to get it done. Intervention LPC is a person who's evaluated, not the one being, the person who is evaluating, not the one being evaluated. The high LPC and the low LPC categories are for the person doing the evaluation. That's for the leader. So there are high LPC leaders and low LPC leaders. So that's a designation for the leader, the one doing the evaluation. If you've got a task that's very unclear versus a task that's very clear, again, you're going to be choosing between low LPC and high LPC. If you've got a task that's really frustrating, something that employees are really struggling to figure out, and they're really struggling to figure out how to do the job well, you may want to be more high LPC, because you give them that support through building this relationship to try and alleviate some of that frustration. If you've got a very clear task where there aren't a whole lot of questions about it, then you can be a little bit more directive in the way in which you manage that person, and here's what you do, and this is how you do it. So again, the structure of the task and the clarity of the task could have an impact upon whether you take a high LPC or a low LPC type of an approach. How much formal power you have as a leader can also have an impact upon which approach you use. If you don't have a whole lot of formal authority and power in your office as a leader, but yet you take a very directive approach in a very low LPC type of an approach, you could very well alienate your employees. However, if you do have a lot of power and authority in your organization, then you might be able to take a more low LPC, task-oriented type of approach to your employees. So I know it's kind of a strange theory when you talk about least preferred coworker, but the idea here is still a solid one in that it's a contingency-based approach. The approach that you use, either task or relationship oriented, will depend upon the situation in which you find yourself. So leaders are usually never completely low LPC or completely high LPC. Leaders are usually not completely transactional or completely transformational. It depends upon the situation in which they find themselves. Now, last week we talked a lot about, I think it was last week, it all run together, but we talked a lot about Vroom's expectancy theory. And many of you wrote about Vroom's expectancy theory in your last Canvas essay. And I probably responded saying, I'm a fan of Vroom's expectancy theory. It just makes some, common sense to me that you could manipulate balances and instrumentalities and expectancies in order to motivate employees. Under Vroom's expectancy theory, it's kind of led to a leadership approach known as the path-goal approach. And based upon Vroom's expectancy theory and the understanding of these balances, instrumentalities, and expectancies. Now, remember the last week, balances speaks to the value that an employee places upon a reward. Instrumentality speaks to the likelihood that a leader or manager is going to make good on the promise of this reward. And then expectancies, the confidence on the part of the employee that if they put forth this amount of effort will then lead to a certain level of performance or productivity. That managers can manipulate those variables in order to motivate their employees. But in manipulating those variables, it introduces to us a theory of leadership known as the path-goal theory of leadership. At the heart of the path-goal theory of leadership is this idea that the leader's primary purpose is to motivate followers by clarifying goals and then identifying the best paths or the most appropriate paths to achieve those goals. So essentially, leaders can lead their employees by helping their employees develop these goals and then remove obstacles that are in the path between the employee and the achievement of this goal. Make the path clear that they can follow in order to achieve this goal. Hence the reason why it's called the path-goal type of theory. So the job of the leader is to manipulate balances, instrumentalities, and expectancies in order to help people be motivated to find this path and follow this path to achieving those goals. Amber, go ahead.
I understand the idea that the leader is trying to motivate the followers to help them along and help them to achieve the goal. How is that then not a sense of micromanaging? And not really kind of emphasizing the employee's ability to kind of move forward and be able to work independently, right, and take their own leadership perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and that's the same question that was asked of human relations theorists back in the day, several decades ago. How is it not micromanaging? One of the ways in which it cannot be micromanaging is that you're working with employees and allowing those employees to participate in the development of their own goals. And so if this was just a manager saying, here's the goal and this is how we're going to accomplish it, what the leader needs to do is the leader needs to sit down with the employee and let that employee participate in the development of the goal. Hopefully, you'll then have goal congruence, where the goal of the employee will be in alignment with the goal of the organization. And once you have that agreed upon goal or set of goals that have been established, because the idea is because the employee was involved in the creation of that goal, they have buy-in in that goal. And they have some self-determination in terms of establishing that goal. So they're going to be more motivated then to try and achieve that goal. And then it's up to the leader to then clear the path so that that employee can then achieve this goal that that employee participated in the development of. But I think, Amber, it's an excellent point that if you don't have that employee involvement in the creation of the goal, it does become very exploitive. It then becomes very much top-down micromanagement. And then it's really starting to look a lot more like those classic organization theories as opposed to the human resource management theory approach that we would like for it to look like. So I think that's a great point, but you need to have that type of participation on the part of employees.
Thank you.
Sure. No, I think it's a great point. So this path goal theory basically tells us there are four basic behavioral styles that can help leaders manipulate balances, instrumentalities, and expectancies in order to motivate their employees and to lead their employees. The 4 different approaches, kind of going from least value to highest value. The first one is the directive approach. Now, the directive approach doesn't have a whole lot of that employee participation that I talked about before. So like Amber said, this would be very much of a top-down, control-oriented, sometimes micromanagement type of approach. It doesn't mean that there's no place for a directive type of behavioral style. Directive behavioral style is obviously what it sounds like. You direct your employees, this is the goal, and this is how you will achieve that goal. Where the directive approach may work is if tasks are very unclear. So if they don't really know what the path is and what path they can take to follow to achieve the goal, there may need to be some direction there to help get them on the appropriate path. However, if that path is already clear and you're dictating a different path for them to go down, that's obviously going to be problematic. But a more, Mary Parker Follett type of approach could be more of a supportive approach. In a supportive approach, it's still some top-down type of control orientation, but you're providing that support to employees whenever tasks are frustrating. So the tasks are frustrating, so you're going to be a little bit more high LPC. You're going to be more supportive and understanding when they're not able to achieve those goals, or they're not able to make the type of progress you would like for them to make toward the achievement of that goal. But where you really get much more Mary Parker Follett-ish, if you will, is in the third behavioral style, which is the participative style. In the participative style, leaders will literally allow people to participate in their own self-determination. So this is very much of the human resource management type of approach. And obviously, as we had said before, hopefully once you allow people to participate in the process, they then have much more buy-in in the outcome of that process. So where we can, we like to use the participative approach, especially for our employees who value self-esteem. So for our employees who are on that Maslowian hierarchy of needs, and they're moving up on that pyramid, they're moving up on that hierarchy of needs, they're really going to appreciate and value this participative type of approach. Then the fourth behavioral approach is the achievement-oriented approach. This is your self-actualization from Abraham Maslow. This is your personal growth from Chris Argyris, where people not only participate in establishing their goals, but they are allowed to determine the jobs that they do, or a large portion of the jobs they do on a daily basis, again, to help them along that personal growth type of arc. People are going to self-select, obviously. Not everyone's going to be achievement-oriented. Some people will be much more oriented around self-esteem. Some people may like direction. So you need to take that into account in terms of leading differently in different situations. But the path goal approach, I think, is an interesting one just because it is so closely connected to Vroom's expectancy theory. Because here again, we are using valences and instrumentalities and expectancies to hopefully make the path apparent for the employee to work toward achieving the goal. And hopefully in the participative approach and the achievement-oriented approach, it's a goal that they have participated in helping to determine themselves. And so you've got a lot more of that employee self-determination with the participative and the achievement-oriented approach as you might have then, as opposed to the directive type of approach. But I think path goals is a good way of kind of taking Vroom's expectancy theory and kind of putting it into this discussion of leadership, and how leaders can take Vroom's expectancy theory and actually actualize it and bring it into reality in order to more effectively lead their employees. Another approach that we've seen grown out of the leadership literature is Hersey and Blanchard's life cycle model. And the life cycle model is very closely related to our good friend Chris Argyris and his personal growth maturation type of theory. And so with this life cycle model, we are assuming that people are going through this personal growth arc, this personal growth process. Whereas they are going through this maturation process, they are increasing their level of maturity, their emotional maturity is increasing, their experience levels are increasing, and the effectiveness of a leader's decision-making style will depend largely on those levels of emotional maturity and the experience of the employees who they are dealing with. So again, going back to this task versus relationship type of orientation, you lead employees based upon where they are, essentially on the arduous personal growth arc. And you lead based on their maturity, their emotional maturity, and their experience levels. So that gives us then 4 different types or 4 different styles in which you can interact with your employees: telling, selling, participating, and delegating. So kind of similar to what we saw on the last screen, but just different words: telling, selling, participating, and delegating. The telling is obviously the micromanagement, the top down, the direction. Oftentimes, it's a very task-oriented approach, oftentimes used for those employees who are not very far along on their personal growth arc. They don't have that level of emotional maturity or that experience yet. So oftentimes, you have to be much more telling in the way in which you interact with those employees. Selling is similar to telling, except instead of just telling them, you're selling them on an idea. You're convincing them that, yes, this approach is in the best interest of the organization, and this approach is in the best interest of you as the employee. But both telling and selling means that the decisions are usually being made at the leadership, the management level, and not at the employee level. And the reason why they're not being at the employee level is because you're assuming these employees are not far along enough in their personal growth arc to really be able to make these types of decisions appropriately or adequately. Participating approach, now you're starting to allow them to truly participate in goal setting, truly participate in making decisions about the process and the ways in which we're creating the outputs of our organization. You're really getting them invested in the process. So these are going to be for individuals who are much farther along in their personal growth development, as Chris Argyris would tell us. Then your 4th is delegating. And delegating will be for those employees who are very far along in this personal growth development. Now, they're the ones who have the emotional maturity, they're the ones who have the experience, so that you can delegate functions to them and turn decision-making over to them. You're not just letting them participate in decision-making, you are giving the decision-making process to them and allowing them to make their own decisions and to self-determine what they're going to be doing and what types of goals they want to try and achieve. But again, delegating in the life cycle model is reserved for those employees who have the emotional maturity in order to be able to make those types of decisions. But again, the connection here between this approach, life cycle, and the path goal approach, and most of the approaches we've talked about so far, is that contingency basis to how we lead. It depends. It depends upon the individual we are dealing with, their level of maturity, and how far along they are in this personal growth process. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach that works in every single situation. Another part of the literature tells us about what we call our attribution models. And attribution models of leadership talk about how we interact with our leaders with our employees when things go wrong. So if things go wrong, and there's poor performance on the part of the employee, the attribution model would tell you that leaders will react based upon the employee themselves. So if the employee has a good performance record, and this poor performance is just an isolated incident, then the leader is going to blame the situation rather than blaming the employee, because this is just a one-off. All the other performance evaluations have been good. I'm going to attribute this poor performance to the situation. It was a weird situation, it was an unusual, atypical situation. This poor performance level is probably not going to happen again. However, if the employee has a poor performance record, that's under the attribution model, that's when leaders are going to blame the employee. Well, if they've done this before, they're doing it again, it's the employee who's the problem, as opposed to the situation being the problem that the employee finds themselves in. But again, Where you place blame depends upon the employee. Leader-member exchange theories, another school of thought that's come out of the leadership literature. Again, emphasizing this idea of a contingency-based approach to leadership. Leader-member exchange theory argues that every leader develops a different relationship with each individual employee. Leaders and employees have a dyadic relationship. Each relationship, or as we refer to it, each dyad, we call the relationship a dyad, each dyad or each relationship with different employees is seen as being a social exchange or some negotiated transaction between the leader and the employee. So the dyadic relationship that a leader has with employee A may look a lot different than the dyadic relationship they have with employee B, based upon, again, going back to Room, the valences and expectancies and instrumentalities. So what's important about these different dyads is that if you've got a different relationship with different employees, it means that you have to know your individual employees. You have to know who they are so you can develop the relationship that is mutually beneficial for both the leader as well as the employee. These dyadic relationships tend to take two forms, a high exchange dyad and a low exchange dyad. High exchange dyadic relationships, you usually have those with trusted subordinates, where there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of two-way back and forth between leader and manager, there's a lot of trust that underpins these high exchange relationships. For subordinates who are not trusted, where that trust and rapport has not yet been built, those dyadic relationships tend to be much more low exchange as opposed to high exchange. But again, just like with all of our theories, it's this contingency-based approach that ties all these different theories together, and it depends upon the individual employee and the relationship between the leader and that employee. In motivation, we talk about operant conditioning, and so you're familiar with operant conditioning and Skinner. We know with operant conditioning, leaders use consequences to shape and mold the behavior of employees. And a couple of people in your posts for this past week talked about your organization using operant conditioning and sometimes using the negative reinforcements and the negative consequences to mold and shape behavior. So we know some of the problems that are associated with operant conditioning. You know, sometimes when we use those negative consequences, those negative reinforcements, we're not shaping behavior as well as we would have hoped. Sometimes if we don't vary the pattern of consequences that we're trying to employees, it won't have the desired effect. And there are a lot of drawbacks to this idea of operant conditioning. What is sometimes more attractive to us in the public sector is something like social exchange theory. And social exchange theory is essentially that social learning theory from Bandura that we talked about last week when we talked about motivation. In social exchange theory, building right off of social learning theory, people learn by watching others. As we talked about last week, they do role modeling. They live vicariously through others. So it's a much more cognitive type of orientation than an orientation as an operant conditioning where you focused on those external types of consequences. Leaders under social exchange theory must take into account the idea of social learning and the internal mental states of their employees. You need to help your employees learn how to anticipate problems and then hopefully learn how to avoid those problems. Help your employees accept goals by involving them in the development of those goals, as we talked about with path goal theory. Help them emphasize their own self-management and self-care. Help them recognize how the environment influences their behavior and the relationship between what they are doing and what's going on in their external environment as well as the internal environment within the organization. And help them with their goal setting, help them with their rehearsal of how to achieve those goals and some of this vicarious learning process that they go through, and help them with their own self-instruction. So you're not using those external consequences like with operant conditioning. Instead, you're focusing more on the cognitive mental state of your employees and helping your employees learn through watching others and role modeling and through self-management types of strategies. So again, in order to do that, you need to know your individual employees, and you're going to use social exchange theory differently with different types of employees in your organization. Another theory, I know we're throwing a lot of theories out, but they're going to come back to you once you get into your next class and your organizational leadership class. Another theory is what's known as cognitive resource utilization theory. And this one focuses more on the leader themselves as opposed to the employee. So what cognitive resource utilization theory looks at is it looks at the intelligence and the experience levels of leaders. And says leaders bring with them intelligence, and they bring with them experience. However, sometimes they're going to rely more on their intelligence, and other times they're going to rely more on their experience. And what determines whether they rely upon intelligence or experience is the stress that they are facing. So when leaders face stressful situations, stress will diminish the leader's ability to think logically and analytically. So when you are in a very low stress situation, you're able to use intelligence as a leader because there's not a whole lot of pressure on you. There aren't a whole lot of those reductions to your ability to think logical and analytically. You can take the time and really focus on being as logical and rational and analytical as you can possibly be. So you use intelligence in low stress situations, but in those high stress situations, you rely more upon your experience, which makes sense. Because when you think about high stress situations, you're going to have to react and adapt very quickly. When you have to react and adapt very quickly, you can't think through a lot of different types of different scenarios and what may happen in one scenario versus another. You have to act quickly, and you act quickly based upon your experience in facing those types of stressful situations in the past. As Angelica says, definitely tested within the department, experience is almost necessary. And that's true. You really need to rely upon that experience in those high stress situations where you don't have the time to sit back and be analytical and really use your intelligence. So cognitive resource utilization theory, again, says it depends. It depends upon the situation in which you find yourself and how stressful that situation is. Low stress, you tend to use your intelligence, be analytical. High stress, you tend to need to rely upon your experience. Obviously, the problem is when you have a leader that does not have that experience and they're thrown into a very high stress type of situation, that's where sometimes you end up getting an organization that doesn't make a decision. And it's kind of paralyzed and not able to make a decision because the experience, the institutional memory of how to respond to a situation like this just really does not exist. So I know I've thrown a lot of different leadership theories at you, but again, what really ties all these theories together, a couple things. One thing that ties them together is obviously this contingency approach, that the theory you apply will depend upon the situation in which you find yourself. The second thread that really ties them together is this whole idea of the task versus relationship orientation, where sometimes leaders tend to be more task-oriented, at other times, they tend to be a little bit more relationship-oriented. That dichotomy, if you will, between task and relationship orientation and the phenomenon where sometimes you need to be more task-oriented, sometimes you need to be more relationship-oriented, really extends into the development of discrete leadership styles from the literature. And I'm sure you've heard of these leadership styles before. Transactional versus transformational versus charismatic leadership. Transactional leadership, as you probably know, tend to be those leaders who engage in these transactions, these trading of rewards for performance. So it goes right back to Chester Barnard, his whole idea of incentives and contributions, and the idea that you provide incentives to your employees, and then those employees will then provide the contributions you need to be successful as a leader in an organization. A lot of people talked about Adams' equity theory in your post from last week. Well, here's your Adams equity theory again, balancing inputs and with those outputs. So you motivate people in the transactional approach by entering into these transactions. You basically end up being kind of a broker between your employees and the achievement of goals. So you provide them the incentives. If they're the right incentives that you place a balance upon, then they will provide you with those contributions. So leadership is transactional in nature. The other approach is this transformational approach. In the transformational approach, you try and raise your followers to a higher plane. This is where you're trying to help your followers self-actualize in Maslowian type of language. You present a vision for success. And that vision of success that you are presenting to your employees serves as a motivator for those employees, and you empower your employees to help achieve that vision for the organization. Transformational leaders usually bring a new culture or vision into the organization, whereas transactional leaders tend not to do that. In political science, there's a whole body of literature looking at mayors and looking at mayors within this context of leadership styles. And so in that literature, the mayor literature, transactional leaders are usually referred to as a broker type of mayor. So they know what people want, what motivates people, and so they provide those spoils, if you will, to those individuals to then get their support and get them to follow. Those are your broker type of mayors. Those broker type of mayors are the ones who tend to stay in office for a very long time because they know the balance that they have to strike in those transactions with all their stakeholders. Transformational leaders tend to be known as the entrepreneurs among mayors. Entrepreneurial mayors bring a vision into the city with them. This is what they want to try and achieve, and this is how they want to achieve it, and then try and work with their employees to empower them and to get them to buy into this vision and this new culture. Ironically, it's those entrepreneurial mayors who oftentimes don't last nearly as long as the broker types of mayors. And the same type of logic then also oftentimes gets applied to city managers as well. And the broker city managers are the ones who tend to last for decades, and the entrepreneurial city managers are the ones who usually last about 18 to 24 months. So it's kind of ironic. We want people to be transformational, but being transformational means you're oftentimes going to burn through a lot of your political capital very quickly. And once you expend your political capital, you're probably not going to stay in that position for very long. But transactional, providing incentives to get contributions, transformational leaders providing a new vision and a culture for people to follow. Again, from the situational contingency-based perspective, we know that effective leaders tend to combine both transactional as well as transformational elements. They typically are never completely transactional or never completely transformational. They are transactional with certain employees in certain situations, and more transformational with other employees in other situations. So it's kind of always going to be that situational leadership, a combination of the two. And Bass kind of says the same thing we already said about the difference between transformational and transactional types of leaders. Then early on tonight, I was mentioning charismatic leadership and people leading due to their charisma and using their charisma as a resource for leading others and getting others to follow them. Charismatic leadership, obviously, you lead by your charisma, you lead by your characteristics. The nice thing about charismatic leadership is that authority resides within that individual leader. And so your followers tend to be a lot more loyal under charismatic leadership than they would be perhaps under transactional or transformational. If your followers really see something in you that they feel that they value, either through a self-concept or an attributional type of approach, they're going to follow you. Under a transactional approach, if you fail to give the right sets of incentives, people probably are going to stop following you eventually. Now, if they're not getting the incentives they thought they were going to get, they're not going to provide those contributions. Transformational, if you can get people to buy into your vision, then obviously they're going to follow you as long as they buy into your vision. Once you expend your capital, sometimes people, especially if your vision is not achieved in a relatively short period of time, people may become disillusioned and may stop following you. So that's a good thing about charismatic leadership. The bad thing, obviously, is that the resource is in the person rather than the position. So the authority comes from the person's characteristics. So whenever that person decides to leave the organization, then the authority goes with that person, and the authority leaves the organization with the individual, as opposed to if it resided in the formal authority of the office. And I see in text chat, Zelensky in Ukraine is an excellent example of a charismatic leader who's demonstrated self-sacrifice, inspired Ukrainians, and managed to become so much more than the leader he was before the Russian invasion. I think there's a pretty broad agreement, across the world that President Zelensky is really kind of showing that type of leadership that really gets people to follow and follow for a very long time, and to make some huge sacrifices in order to follow that leadership. And I think one of the reasons why is because he's showing some of these attributes that people value. And there are two different strains of charismatic leadership. There's the attribution theory and the self-concept theory. And the attribution and self-concept theory in charismatic leadership help explain to us why followers follow charismatic leaders. So, the attribution approach to charismatic leadership says that followers are going to be more likely to identify with the leader and follow that leader if that leader advocates a vision that is highly discrepant from the status quo. I think you see that in Zelensky. I mean, you usually would think that, well, the city is being encircled, that a lot of leaders would leave. They would get out of town while they could get out of town. And today I saw he did a little short video from his president's office right there in Kiev. And I think that's an example of something that's discrepant as compared to how we might think other leaders would react in that situation. They act in unconventional ways. They're not that predictable, and they're willing to take risks and willing to take chances. And people actually value that, and they respect that. Those who demonstrate self-sacrifice, and again, you're seeing that in Ukraine today. Those who have confidence in their vision, confidence in their abilities. Those who are able to use those persuasive appeals rather than just relying upon authority, where they can actually persuade people. Because again, the public sector of that authority is going to be very, very limited just because of the nature of the public sector. So they lead through those persuasive types of appeals. That's what we call the attribution theory of charismatic leadership. You see characteristics in someone that you really value, and so you follow that person based upon those characteristics. Then there's the self-concept theory of charismatic leadership. The self-concept theory emphasizes observable characteristics of leaders and followers. So if you can personally identify with a leader, you can say, I really see a lot of myself in that person, then you're probably going to follow that person, be more likely to follow that person. Social identification, self-esteem, internalization of leaders' beliefs. Basically with self-concept, you kind of see yourself in that person, and you've internalized the beliefs of that individual leader. You're going to be more likely to follow that person because you kind of see yourself in that person. Just two different ways to explain why people tend to follow charismatic leaders. But again, the big thing about charismatic leadership is where the power resides. And again, the power tends to reside in the person, in the leader themselves, as opposed to any type of formal office. So you get some very ardent followers for these charismatic leaders, but the authority is very transient in that it's in the person, it's not in the formal office itself. I've done a lot of work at my university writing and rewriting constitutions. And we write our constitution, we're always empowering different committees and empowering different bodies with the types of things and functions that we expect them to do. And one of the things I always push back against is a lot of people want to amend the Constitution or revise the Constitution based upon the person who is currently in that position. So, we love the dean. We think the dean's a great leader. We trust the dean. And so, I think we should let the dean have a lot more power and a lot more authority and take some of that authority away from faculty council. And my response is always no. You don't do that for the person in the office. You look at the office itself, and you write the powers for the office, not for the person, because that person may be gone tomorrow. And at my university, we tend to get a new dean every 3 to 4 years. And so that person then moves up to be a provost, or whatever the case may be. And you've now given all these powers to an incoming dean who you don't really even know how they're going to exercise those powers. And I think that's an important kind of distinction there between your charismatic leadership and where the authority lies within the person, as opposed to lying and residing in the authority of the office itself. But we would hope, even though we know in situational leadership that at times our leaders are going to be transactional, at other times they're going to be a little bit more transformational, we kind of like to follow transformational leaders. We kind of like this idea of a leader having a vision and bringing a new culture into the organization. So transformational leaders oftentimes embody their vision in the organization through the creation of a social architecture. And that social architecture then becomes the organization's culture. So they bring in basic symbols and core values and culture into the organization. And by doing so, they are then able to bring their values into the organization. So how do leaders then bring this culture, transformational leaders bring this culture into the organization? Well, we've talked about organization culture before, so you should be familiar with this, but there are different aspects of organization culture. Some aspects are very shallow and very visible. Some aspects are very deep and much less visible. So the artifacts of an organization, the meeting notes and minutes and agendas, and those types of things, those are very shallow. Those are very easy to see in trying to understand the culture that the leader brings into the organization. At a deeper, more hidden level are those espoused values we talked about before, mission statements, ethical codes, codes of conduct. This is where the organization tells you this is what we are all about, but they're not as abundant and ubiquitous as your meeting notes and agendas and minutes and all those types of things. At the very heart, though, of culture, at the deepest level, that is the most invisible, is basic underlying assumptions. So the basic underlying assumptions of the organization, what we all value as an organization, but we don't talk about on a daily basis. We may, the example I used before, we may value collegiality and treating each other with respect and as colleagues, but we may not talk about it a lot. We may not even have that as part of our ethical code, but it is something that we all understand and that we all accept as an organizational culture. But that's going to be very deep because we don't talk about it. So that's going to be kind of hard to extract from the organization when we study that organization culture. So how then do leaders bring culture into the organization? How do they communicate this culture to the organization? One way they do it is through symbols. So physical objects, settings, roles within an organization can convey information about the values and basic assumptions of that organization. Language, songs, slogans, jargons can also convey culture. I think I shared with you in my school district that together we achieve more is what the superintendent brought in. That's a slogan. Ford, quality is job one. That's a slogan to try and communicate culture. Narratives, some of these urban myths, some of these stories in the organization that people tell all the time communicate culture. Practices and events. And so having special events, employee recognition nights, and employee of the week types of celebrations also can help communicate that culture. So there are a lot of ways to communicate culture, but how do you really embed and reinforce that culture into your organization as a transformational leader? Well, one way we've talked about before is you make clear what you will monitor, ignore, measure, and control, what you pay attention to. So if you pay attention to certain types of behaviors, obviously employees pick up on that, and those are the behaviors they're probably going to engage in. How you react to a crisis situation will send cultural messages to your employees, your followers. The type of role modeling and teaching and coaching that you engage in. the criteria that are established for advancement and punishments. Coordinate organizational designs and structures with your cultural messages so that your structure matches your cultural message. And so if your message is we're an open organization where we have a free flow of communication and building of trust and rapport, and then your physical space means that you have cubicles and no one ever interacts with anyone else, that's not a coordination between your design and your cultural messages. Coordinate organizational systems and procedures with your cultural messages. Mentioned that one. Design physical spaces, like I said, not having cubicles if you're going to be an open type of organization. Employ stories about events and people. Develop formal statements of organizational philosophy, and approach cultural leadership as a comprehensive organizational change. And so those true transformational leaders, when they are truly effective, they really do bring this new culture into that organization and get people to then buy in to that new culture. We would hope that our transformational leaders are entrepreneurial in nature, and we hope that we have entrepreneurial leaders. Entrepreneurial leaders tend to have a high skill level and a very strong commitment to the goals of the program or the organization. Those leaders who have a very low skill level and very low commitment to the goals of the program, the organization, they become your administrative survivors. They're just there to try and get by. They're not there to try and make any big momentous type of change. Those who have a high skill level but are not terribly committed to the goals of the program, the organization, those are your generalists. And those who have a very strong commitment to goals but a very low skill level, those tend to be your program zealots. Those zealots, as Tony Downs talked to us about last week in his 5 different bureau ideologies. But hopefully our leaders can have that strong commitment as well as a good skill set as a leader, so they can be those entrepreneurial leaders who are able to then transform our organizations and transform the culture of the organization as they enter. Effective leaders, though, we also know need to be able to be effective at managing groups, managing conflict between those groups, and fostering communication. So just very briefly, let's talk about how leaders can manage groups, can manage conflict, and can foster effective communication within their organizations. Effective leaders need to understand groups. They need to understand where groups come from. They need to understand the relationship between groups and the larger organization. And they need to take certain actions and steps to try and manage groups in a productive manner as possible. And we know groups can be both good and bad for organizations. Elton Mayo, in his Hawthorne experiment, talked to us a lot about the good aspects of groups. He said groups are good because they can foster performance, and you can have members of groups place pressure on people in the group who are not performing well to push us to higher levels of productivity. They fit some, and they kind of suit some of the social needs of individuals within the organization. So we know groups can outperform individuals because you have a collective availability of talent and resources within a group that you may not have in one individual person. We know, as we said, and Mayo told us, group dynamics can motivate individuals. We also know that this interaction between members of groups can foster knowledge and creativity. There's interpenetration and integration that Mary Parker Follett talked to us about. We also know there are negatives to groups. One of the primary negatives to groups is this idea of groupthink, which we'll talk about in a second. We know that groups can encourage the wrong culture in the organization. It can actually work at cross purposes from the transformational leader. The transformational leader is trying to put one culture in the organization, and then you have groups that are working at the opposite direction to kind of undo all that good work that transformational leaders are doing. We also know that groups can then also encourage the presence of free riders, in that there are some people who will get all the benefits from a group without putting in the costs. If we assume that people are rational, self-interested actors, that they're going to try and maximize their benefits and they're going to try and minimize their costs. But effective leaders can have positive impacts upon these groups and group behavior. Julie asked, what do we mean by groups? Cliques at work, community groups, unions. We're usually talking more of those cliques at work. So we're talking about, maybe like back when I was in Illinois, there was the lunch bunch, a bunch of faculty members who got together and went to lunch, and they were all the more senior faculty members who were kind of set in their ways, and they would use their lunches together, number one, to consume a lot of alcohol, but in addition to consuming a lot of alcohol, they would use those lunches to come up with ways to undo all the things the department was trying to do. And then they would come back armed to that faculty meeting with all these different arguments against what the department was trying to do. Yeah, brown bag type of crew. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about, those more kind of informal groups that tend to form within our organizations. Sometimes what will happen is that we rely so much upon these groups, and we have these groups that become so powerful that they will engage in groupthink. And I'm sure you've been exposed to groupthink and some of Janice's writing on groupthink before. Groupthink is a type of thought that's exhibited by group members who try to minimize conflict and reach consensus without critically evaluating ideas. So they try and suppress other ideas. They try and suppress countervailing opinions, and oftentimes do that through retaliation against people who do not agree with the position of the group. Means that we end up with a loss of independent thinking, and we don't have as many viewpoints to utilize in our analysis as we normally would have. It is very much of a decision-making shortcut. So leaders need to work to try and avoid those types of instances of groupthink. Ways you can do that is have critical evaluators, have 2 or more groups to work on a decision independently rather than just one group. Accept criticism of the actions of the group and your own actions, breaking the group up into subgroups. Again, we're not going to go through them all, but there are a lot of things you can do. One thing that a lot of leaders like to do, and I always like to play this role, is assign a member to play devil's advocate. So someone to disagree with what the group came up with so that the group can think about some of these countervailing types of opinions and other ways to address an issue. It's a good question about how do you ensure there's diversity while trying to implement specific culture of an organization, not come off as controlling. That's a great point. The way in which I think you would do it is you do it through involvement. You do it through delegation. You do it through participation. And so you have a direction you want the organization to go in, but you need to have the buy-in on the part of your employees. And so they need to be involved in the creation of that culture. It can't be something that's just imposed upon people. Everyone has to then participate. Mary, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Would you say that as people become eligible and enter the workforce at this point, that the education community has taught groupthink? Because when you look at your K-12 people, they put them into groups, okay, come together and come to a decision. And it just kind of seems to me that they're taught more how to do groupthink than more independent. And so we would be seeing more of that in the younger generations coming through in today's workforce. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think we not only see that in teacher preparation. I think we see that on a daily basis in our schools, in the way in which we encourage teachers to plan. We encourage teachers to plan through team-based planning, so grade level planning. And so rather than doing it individually, they will get together as a team or as a grade level, and they will do their planning as a team or a grade level. One of the major issues that I know I always dealt with when I was on the school board in terms of collective bargaining were the collaborative planning days that teachers were given. And the teacher union really pushed back on having administratively led collaborative planning days. They want their collaborative planning days to just be the grade level teachers without a lot of guidance from administration. And so one of the ways we usually would get agreement with the teachers union is we would get them to give up something, and we would give them more teacher-based collaborative planning days. And we kept eroding the administrative input in those collaborative planning days contract after contract after contract until they got down to maybe 3 or 4 collaborative planning days that were actually staff administrative led, and all the rest were led by these grade level groups. And I do think there's a lot of that collaboration that goes on. You know, obviously that can be good and that can be bad. That can be good if there are, ideas being shared in terms of this, type of group dynamic. It could be bad if you have just this group and there are no other ideas outside the group that are being entertained, and all the ideas are just coming from this small group of 3 or 4 people. So I think, I think that we do a lot of collaboration. Sometimes doing that collaboration actually ends up creating some type of group thing. And so that's why as a district, we kind of pushed back and tried to get more administratively like collaborative days so that we could have groups working with groups and administrators, principals, and assistant principals helping to guide some of these discussions. So you just didn't have one static group making all the decisions for that one grade level. So it is a balancing act, and it's difficult to achieve that balance because groupthink is something that can really sneak up on you.
Yeah, and that's with regard to the teachers, but I'm thinking that the teachers are teaching the children a groupthink type of a process, as opposed to independent thinking and coming up with their own visions nowadays.
Critical thinking, critical analysis is supposed to be the bedrock of, back when we were doing Common Core, it was the bedrock of Common Core, and now it's supposed to be the bedrock of what's now ESSA, the new piece of legislation. So it's supposed to be critical analysis and thinking. I think it all depends upon how teachers teach. Teachers help students develop their critical analysis skills and develop their critical thinking skills. I think that's what's going to benefit students in the future. However, if they don't help them develop those critical analysis skills, then they don't have the skills to question things, and they're just going to accept what they're being told. So again, it's that tough balancing act. I don't really want to come down on one side or the other, but I just would emphasize the importance of critical analysis and critical thinking. Now, that's really what education is about, and that's true at the graduate level too. I mean, that's why in none of my classes is there a right or wrong answer to pretty much anything. You critically analyze situations and you apply what you believe is the most appropriate theory or approach to that situation. And if you've gone through a critical analysis process, you've analyzed all the important elements and you've justified why this is the most appropriate thing to do, then in my courses, you're good. Because you have demonstrated that critical analysis. And it's that critical analysis that really cuts across disciplines. Now, you need critical analysis regardless of what discipline you're in. If you're in political science or public administration or engineering or biology or history, critical analysis is what ties all of education together. And I think that's what is imperative, is teaching those critical analysis and critical thinking skills. And again, that's true at all levels of education. I wish in our graduate programs, there is more of that. And that's why in my program, I always encourage my faculty members not to use traditional examinations. And whenever I use something like an exam, it's an assessment. And I provide scenarios, I write scenarios for my students, and then they apply theories and concepts they've learned to those scenarios, because that measures critical analysis and thinking, doesn't just measure rote memorization. And there's very, from my perspective, there's very little role for rote memorization in a graduate program. But that's just me, and I could be wrong, but that's the way in which I've always approached it. Let's see, I know I missed some things. Let's see, I feel much more comfortable speaking up against a group. Current political polarization tends to give a voice to those who speak the loudest, while the silent majority only listens. Is that intimidation, or is that a form of groupthink? I was actually just talking about this earlier. It's I always say when, well, I'm off the board, so I can say this, but whenever we would have parents come, oftentimes it would just be a very small number of parents, but they would be a very loud minority. And the majority of the parents who were happy with the way things were going, they wouldn't come to the board meeting because they were happy with how things were going. And sometimes some of my colleagues would have a knee-jerk response to one or two people in the audience. And I would always lean over to them and go, squeak, 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 because sometimes it's a squeaky wheel that gets the oil. And that's a concern, I think, especially in this current political environment, is that sometimes elected officials respond to very loud complaints but those loud complaints are only coming from a handful of people, whereas the vast majority of folks are satisfied with how things are going. Go ahead, Ashley, go ahead.
I agree with you, and I actually think that's it's a huge problem because and of course my end size is just the organization I work with, but I see that, decisions being made and sort of the vision of reality, quote unquote, being formed in the heads of administrators based on, 2 or 3 calls from concerned parents who feel so passionately about an issue that they will actually make a call to a state agency about it. Whereas the remaining, 5 million parents clearly don't, care about the issue that highly. They're probably not as aware of the issue, and at the end of the day, what the officials come away with is, this is what our parents think. So it's a very small vocal minority that sadly often shapes how officials see issues or their sort of their importance.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, that's been my experience in my 6 years on the board. And again, it's unfortunate because whenever you make these big policy decisions for 2 or 3 folks and you ignore your entire rest of your constituency, obviously you're going to stop serving their needs. And I understand the motivation. Oftentimes among my colleagues that, well, these folks are mad at me, and so I really need to make them happy and to placate them. But I was always of the opinion, you do what's right and you let the chips fall where they may. And if you do what's right and you don't get reelected, you did what's right, and that's what matters. And so actually that was one of the reasons why I didn't run again in 2020, is I was kind of done with it. And I well, I'll leave it there. But it can be difficult to be in that position, and to be yelled at from the floor, being called a child abuser, or because you're not supporting what they want the school to do. And it's just really gets to be a very antagonistic situation. But I would agree. We need to recognize that, just because a few people are allowed, it doesn't mean they reflect the wants, needs, and desires of the rest of the community. So, but I'll leave that there. But good. I agree with you. I think it's a good discussion. If the discussion needs to be had, I don't think we have that discussion nearly enough. So sometimes, political imperatives trump all other imperatives. Whenever I teach my budgeting class, I would always say political imperatives trump economic imperatives. And I think it's true that political imperatives for a lot of elected officials are going to trump every other imperative out there. And that is unfortunate. But just to wrap up this discussion, leaders can also, or need to also, be effective in terms of managing communication in their organization, the flow of communication. Leaders, when they manage communication, need to try and avoid some of these distortions and some of these dysfunctions that go on in terms of communication within an organization. We're not going to go through them all, but it's provided for you there on the screen. Barriers to effective communication are things such as a lack of feedback, one-way communication where you get no return communication in exchange, noise in the communication process, distractions that make it difficult to communicate from one person or one group to another, misuse of language, using very vague and very ambiguous and inaccurate or inflammatory emotional language can also be a dysfunction in the communication process. Listening deficiencies, receivers of information who are inattentive and passive and don't really listen to what's being communicated to them. Barriers to effective communication between groups, when there's conflict between the groups, and a conflict is designed as being kind of a zero-sum game, a win or lose type of situation. When groups try to enhance their own power and emphasize only their own goals rather than the goals of the organization. When threats are used, obviously, has a very chilling effect on communication, and so on and so on. And the type of communication distortions we tend to see in public organizations are things such as distorted perceptions, inaccurate perceptions of information that result from preconceived ideas. This is something we deal with a lot in our organizations, where people will consume information through a perceptual screen. And if it's information that does not confirm their a priori opinion or position, then they consider that to be, fake information. And it creates that cognitive dissonance. And that cognitive dissonance then means that they're not going to absorb that communication. Erroneous translation, interpretation of information by receivers in ways that are not intended by the senders. This has kind of become a big thing with our virtual work in terms of emails replacing face-to-face conversations. And sometimes we'll write an email with nice intent, and we're not trying to be curt, or we're not trying to be dismissive of someone, but someone reads their email in a different way than which it was intended. And I think that's a problem that we're seeing more and more with remote work. Lack of congruence, which I mentioned before, distrusted source. And so if people don't trust the source, they're not going to trust the communication coming out of that source. The use of too much jargon obviously gets in the way sometimes of our communication, our organizations. And then manipulating, withholding information. This is your principal-agent relationship that we introduced several weeks ago, where you think the principal has more information than the agent, but it's really the agent that has the information. And so when the agent then has to decide how much or what information to give to the principal to make oversight possible, that's where you end up with this moral hazard of what information to give, how much information to give to this principal for that oversight. And so I think we've got a lot of these issues that leaders have to be at least mindful of in trying to manage effective communication throughout their organizations. Now, you don't have time to really get into a lot of the strategies. That's something that would be more appropriate for an entire course on communication in the public sector. And there are more and more MPA programs that are creating communication courses that they're offering as core elements of their required curriculum. It's become such a big topic that it's now a fodder for an entire class, and sometimes even entire programs themselves. We also know effective leaders have to effectively manage conflict. We know, as Mary Parker Follett tells us, conflict is a natural part of all organizations, especially organizations that operate as democratic organizations. So the more participation you have involved in your organization, the more communication you have, the more potential you're going to have conflict within that community, that organization. We know conflict can actually be productive if that conflict is managed effectively and correctly, but it can be disastrous if it's ignored or if it's mismanaged. What ties conflict together with communication is that conflict oftentimes results from bad communication. People are not communicating effectively, people are saying things, and people are taking those things in a different way than they were intended, and that's what oftentimes causes a conflict within the organization. We know conflict is a natural part of any democracy and any democratic organization. We know in the public sector, we have all these turf wars, and we have all this competition for resources. We have all these policy dilemmas that we have to deal with. And we know that the Madisonian system of separation of powers also introduces conflict into our organizations as well. The many masters argument that we serve an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch will also introduce conflict into our organization. Conflict, we know, can be both horizontal as well as vertical. We know that conflict can exist within a person, between people, as well as between groups. And again, conflict not only comes from bad communication, it can come from disagreement of goals, it can come from disagreement over values, it can come to disagreement over culture, disagreement over priorities. There are a lot of sources for conflict in our organizations. Conflict, the good thing is that conflict oftentimes doesn't just happen immediately. And conflict oftentimes develops in a much more gradual type of sense. So the first stage of conflict is also oftentimes referred to as latent conflict. In latent conflict, the conditions are there, and the stage is set for conflict to occur, and conflict is just kind of waiting to happen. So it hasn't broken out yet, but the conditions are right for conflict to occur. Then the second stage is perceived conflict. Perceived conflict, people sense the conflict, but they kind of deny it and downplay it because they're not being directly impacted by the conflict yet. They kind of sense it, but they ignore it. Then the third phase is felt conflict. This is where conflict is experienced as discomfort. You get tension and anger in the organization. People really start to experience that conflict. Then the manifest conflict stage, this is where it becomes open warfare. You got a winner and you got a loser. If you don't intervene, at least at the manifest conflict stage, this is where the conflict can become very, very destructive. And then there's the conflict aftermath. This is after the outbreak of conflict, when the results of who wins and who loses, those results are evident. Conflict will then breed more conflict, and then that conflict sort of takes on a life of its own. So in terms of these different stages, where you need to intervene is hopefully, if not at, perhaps even before the manifest conflict stage. Because once conflict manifests and once you move into the conflict aftermath, you then end up with this self-perpetuating cycle of conflict occurring again and again and again. So how do leaders and people respond to conflict? How they respond is, again, dependent upon their concern for their own goals versus their concern for the group's goals. So if you have someone who is not terribly concerned about their own goals, they're not terribly concerned about the goals of the group, they're going to respond with avoidance. Leave me alone, not my business, I don't have anything to do with it. If you have someone who's very concerned about their own goals, but not terribly concerned about the goals of the group or the organization, you end up with competition. It's a zero-sum game. I'm going to do everything in my power to win this conflict. I win, and by definition, you then lose. That's a competition approach to conflict. In the middle, you've got compromise, where you're kind of halfway on concern for group goals, halfway in terms of concern for your own goals. Let's meet halfway and try and compromise. I give up something, you give up something. If you score very high on group goals, but very low on your own goals, you're going to give in. And that's a combination. Well, fine, you win, you get your way. I'm not really that concerned about it. And then there's collaboration. Collaboration is for those who score very high on their own goals, very high on group goals. This is Mary Parker Follett's interpenetration and integration. Through interpenetration, we have a commingling of ideas. Through that commingling of ideas, we can come up with a new way of addressing the issue. And through that collaboration, that creation of that new way of addressing the issue, everybody wins, which is obviously the most desired way of dealing with conflict. But I think the most important for leaders is to understand that conflict is natural in public organizations. And the more democratic your organization is, the more participation that goes on in your organization, the more likely you are to have conflict. The more likely you are to have conflict, the more you have to put effort and resources in to try to manage that conflict productively. And we know that conflict is endemic to public organizations because we have a lot of people trying to influence decision-making in the public sector. There's a lot more power sharing situations among actors in the public sector. We know we have a very diverse workforce, diverse backgrounds, cultures, and interests. We know that we have rules, regulations, and reporting requirements we've talked about several times in this class that can have impacts upon the decision-making process and can cause conflict itself. We know that our goals tend to be ambiguous and vague and very difficult to measure. We have those softer goals in the public sector, so there can be conflict about how to measure those goals and how to know when we have achieved those goals. We also know that in the public sector, we tend to be much more service-oriented and information intense than we may be in the private sector. When you're more service-oriented, you're coming into contact with more people outside the organization, which again, provides more opportunity for conflict. So obviously, effective leaders need to effectively manage groups, they need to effectively manage communication, and they need to effectively manage conflict within their organizations. Now, again, this was kind of an hour and a half tour de force of leadership and the leadership literature. just kind of hitting the tip of the iceberg and the highlights in terms of different types of theories that have come out of the leadership literature and their applicability in the public sector. You can kind of look at this more as kind of a taste of what's to come in your organization leadership class. I'm sure you'll get into a lot of these theories in a lot more detail in your next course. But you cannot have, obviously, an effective organization unless you have effective leadership. And some of these theories hopefully will help contribute to making everyone more effective leaders for their organizations. So that is my story so far tonight. So I know we've covered a lot of theories and we've talked a lot about different approaches to leadership. Again, what people usually take away from the discussion of leadership literature is this difference between transformational, transactional, and charismatic leadership. And I think, again, the thing that really ties it all together is the contingency, contextual nature of leadership. We really lead in a situational type of nature today, where it depends upon the situation, the people we are dealing with, the amount of stress that we are facing as an organization, the amount of trust in our organization, relationships between employees, relationships between groups. All of that contributes to our decision in terms of when to be transactional versus when to be more transformational. Yeah, servant leadership, I think, it kind of is another category in and of itself, in that it really speaks a lot more toward public over private interest, and the idea of, you lead to serve others, you lead to benefit others. And I think if you had to put it in a category, I think we probably put servant leadership more in the transformational category than we probably would in the transactional type of category. I know we're really late. I'm sorry, we're well past 7:30 and we haven't gotten to our breakout groups yet. So I apologize for that. But again, a lot of information that we need to do here in the first half of the class tonight. Since we are at 7:36, let's go ahead and take a break. I know we probably can all use one. So let's say 7:36. Let's come back at we'll call it 7:50. And when we come back at 7:50, then we'll wrap up the information, take any more questions you may have about the information, and then we'll launch into the second half of class with our breakout groups as we normally do. So take a break, come on back at 7:50, and we will finish up for the evening. Okay, we are back. Hope you had a good break. Let's do our breakout groups. And so the prompt for this session of breakout groups, please consider your organizations and the leadership styles approaches you see within those organizations. What leadership styles are most common in your organizations? And each group should select a spokesperson, as always, to share your results with the class. So I'm looking at where we are at in terms of numbers tonight. We'll just do our normal 4 breakout rooms as we usually do. So I've created the rooms. I'll go ahead and open them up. Let's say we'll work on this until 8:20, and then 8:20 we'll reconvene. We'll see what each group came up with, and then take any last-second questions or observations about any of the information for tonight, and then we'll be able to call it an evening. So let me open up the rooms, and then everyone can have at it. Okay, we should all be back now. So hopefully each group had time to get your work done. Again, not asking a lot in this breakout group, just basically the types of leadership styles used in your organizations. So let's start with group number 1.
Yeah, so group number 1, we all had leaders in organizations that have common threads from all 3 types of leadership. It just really depended on the circumstance. But the most common thread, the most common one was the transactional leadership style.
Okay. Very good. And that typically is what we usually see with this exercise, is that there's a combination of the 3, but of the 3, it's usually transactional. It tends to be seen more often than the others. So, okay, great. Room number 2.
I think that's us, right? Okay. So in terms of leadership style, we had a variety of people in our class, our group. So Kasia kind of had a combination of the transactional approach, transformational approach, and kind of a servant leadership approach, more at the bottom level, not so much the top level of her organization. Primarily transactional or transformational with the educational aspect that need to teach children, but also the servant leadership, according to what I picked up in the conversation, that leadership doesn't really care about or check in with the employees at the lower level. They're more interested in just getting the product done, which is more the transactional. And with Shannon, who also works in education, she finds that the transformational approach is more prominent, mainly the need to want to teach and help children, especially in her what she does in special needs. And then charismatic approach really kind of helps helps the kids follow. In Sheila's situation, she felt like kind of that the life cycle model kind of and the delegation was more what fell into her situation, and she works in a university, so it's more being delegated work with no explanation. For me, I work in County Santa Barbara, so it's more, I find it more transactional, very neat, goal oriented, get things done. Also, I found that the path goal theory really spoke to just the government in general, with kind of all four: directive, supportive, achievement, and participation, based on the situation and the level of expertise that the employee has.
Good, very good.
That was long-winded, sorry.
No, it's great. And yeah, I think, again, it underscores we see a lot of different approaches in a lot of different organizations, a lot of organizations that use multiple approaches. I agree with you. The path goal kind of also speaks to me as well. I see that a lot. And in terms of the university, I think that the life cycle model also works well, because we do oftentimes get delegated things without any explanation as to why they're being delegated to us and what we're supposed to do with them. So I've experienced that at the university level as well. So, but yeah, again, it's a combination of a lot of these different approaches. Again, contingent upon the situation in which we find ourselves. Employees we're dealing with, their level of emotional maturity, the amount of stress the organization is facing, and so on and so on. So very good. Thank you. Group number 3.
Hey everyone, it's Lauren here. We got into a little bit more on the theory side, but synthesizing our conversation, it was really around transactional leadership and then some transformational leadership. Like my city librarian and director does have a charismatic sort of transformational piece to it, but then like when she brings it back to organization, it's super transactional. A couple of the theories that spoke to us were the life cycle theory and the path goal theory, because we see, as a group, we saw those leadership styles and that way of working throughout all of our organizations. But we did have a little bit of the cognitive resource theory, where they really relied heavily on their own experience and sort of what they've done before. So the majority of us, though, really looked at the life cycle theory and the path goal theory around how to, like, the transactional piece of the leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the transactional approach to leadership is obviously the most straightforward, and it's easy for the leader to understand. It's easy for the employee to understand, and it can be effective. As long as the leader knows what employees value and the types of incentives that they value, then you can extract contributions from them if you provide the right set of incentives that are valued. And I think a lot of leaders really feel an immediacy. They have to produce results immediately if they want to remain in their position or move up to higher level positions. And sometimes it's that transactional approach that can get you those immediate effects. Transformational leadership is sometimes more gradual. It's going to take you more time to build this culture and embed this culture and get employee buy-in in the culture. So you're not going to have real immediate effects from transformational leadership. And so I think that's one of the reasons we do tend toward more transactional leadership, especially in the public sector. Very good. Okay, thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you.
And room number 4.
Hello. So we kind of discussed both the leadership styles and approaches, and basically we had like law enforcement and military in our group. So we kind of went with that. And as far as like the approach, we came up with the cognitive resource utilization theory, and somewhat the path goal with a bit of top-down control micromanagement style. And then as far as the type of leadership, just like basically everyone else, we went with the transactional leaders, some charismatic, but mostly transactional.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Veronica. And yeah, certainly when you deal with paramilitary organizations, sometimes it changes a little bit. There is much more of that directing. There's much more of that top-down control that you typically get from paramilitary organizations like law enforcement organizations. And so we oftentimes do see that transactional approach in a lot of those organizations. And so it's always interesting when I teach organization theory, I always have a large percentage of folks in the class who work in law enforcement and work in paramilitary organizations. And it's always interesting to compare the structure and the behaviors and the approaches from those organizations to folks in social service organizations, which is another large percentage of people in a lot of my courses. And it's always an interesting dichotomy between those two types of organizations. But again, I think, this is kind of a straightforward exercise, but I think it was very helpful because it once again underscores that contextual approach to leadership. And there's not one right or wrong approach to leadership. It really does depend upon the situation. So thank you to all of our spokespersons for doing a great job. And thanks to all the groups for partaking in that activity. That's pretty much our coverage of leadership for this class. Again, we're looking at leadership for effective organizations. You'll pick up on these themes again in your next class and delve in them into a lot more detail. Are there any last minute questions or observations or anything about the leadership material we have covered tonight? Okay. All right, then if not, that's all I have for this evening. Again, we'll have our last Zoom session next Monday. I'll be doing it from Las Vegas for my conference. So we'll do a truncated session, but we'll just kind of wrap up next week and talk about the necessary conditions for effectiveness and kind of just put a bow on everything. And then on the 20th will be the due date then for your chosen solution paper. So as you're working on that, any other questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I will talk to you again next Monday. So thanks a lot and have a great week, everyone. Take care.